Someone I know once shared an interesting story with me. That being one of their earliest memories was trying to wake up one of their relatives and not being able to. And as a child, they did not really understand why. But as they got older, they realized drug addiction was always a part of their family. Just over 100 years ago, drugs were banned in the United States and Britain, and then it was imposed upon the rest of the world. At that time, the authorities believed that by doing this, it would deter them. It would give them an incentive to stop. A few years ago, they were looking at the addicts in their lives whom they loved, and they were trying to figure out if there was some way to really help them. And they found themselves asking basic questions they just did not know the answer to. They read loads of stuff about it, and could not really find the answers they were looking for. So they decided to go and spend some time with different people from around the world who have lived this, and talk to them to see if they could learn from them. And they ended up going and meeting lots of different people. From a heroin dealer in Las Vegas to a scientist who spends a lot of time feeding hallucinogens to chimpanzees to see if they like them. And it turns out they actually do. Portugal is the only country that has ever decriminalized all drugs, from cannabis to crack. And what they realized was, everything we think we know about addiction is wrong. But let us start with what we think we know. So imagine for 20 days you went off and used heroin 3 times a day. Imagine you did that, right? What would happen? Because there are chemical hooks in heroin. You would assume your body would become dependent on those hooks. You'd start to physically need them. And at the end of those 20 days, you'd all be heroin addicts, right? But there is something not right with this story. So let us look at it from another angle. You get hit by a car and break your hip. You would be taken to the hospital and be given loads of diamorphine. Now, diamorphine is heroin, but it's much better than the heroin that you're ever going to buy on the streets. Because the stuff you can buy from a drug dealer is contaminated. Very little of it is heroin. Whereas the stuff that you would get from the doctor is medically pure, and you can be given it for a lengthy period. If what we believe about addiction is right, those people who are exposed to all that medically pure heroin and its chemical hooks, the same thing should happen. They should become addicts. This does not happen. If you know a member of your family who may have had some type of major surgery, for instance, a hip replacement, how come they did not leave the hospital as a junkie? In Vancouver, there's a man called Bruce Alexander, who was a professor of psychology a few years ago. He conducted an incredible experiment. Professor Alexander explained that the idea of addiction, as we have been told, comes partly from a series of experiments that were conducted earlier in the 20th century. If you get a rat and you put it in a cage, and you give it 2 water bottles, one is just water, and the other is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. The rat will almost always prefer the drugged water and almost always kill itself quite quickly. However, in the 1970s, Professor Alexander looked at this experiment, and he noticed something. He said, we are putting the rat in an empty cage. It has nothing to do except use these drugs. So Professor Alexander built a cage that he called Rat Park. They were given loads of cheese. They have loads of colored balls, and they have loads of tunnels. More importantly, they have got loads of friends. They can have loads of sex. And they have got both the water bottles, the normal water, and the drugged water. But here's the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, they do not like the drugged water. They almost never use it. None of them ever use it compulsively, and none of them ever overdose. And Professor Alexander thought, maybe this is just a rat thing? Now this is where it gets interesting, because at the exact same time, the Vietnam War was still in full swing. And around 20% of all American troops were also using loads of heroin. And everyone was worried because they thought that upon their return there were going to be hundreds of thousands of junkies on the streets of the United States. The Archives of General Psychiatry did a detailed study, and it turns out none of them went to rehab. Now, if you believe the story about chemical hooks, that makes absolutely no sense. So, Professor Alexander began to think there might be a different story about addiction. What if addiction is an adaptation to your environment? Now, also in the Netherlands, there was another professor called Peter Cohen who said, we should not even call it addiction. Human beings have a natural and innate need to bond. And when we are happy and healthy, we will bond and connect. But if you cannot do that because you are traumatized or isolated or beaten down by life, you will bond with something that will give you some sense of relief. Now that might be gambling, that might be pornography, that might be cocaine, that might be cannabis, but you will bond and connect with something, as that is our nature. That is what we want as human beings. Now, everywhere in the world, addicts are treated in a way that causes separation and isolation. They are punished, shamed, barriers are put in place that disconnect them from society. In Canada, there is a doctor, and his name is Gabor Marte, who also said, there is a place in the world that decided to do the exact opposite. In the year 2000, Portugal had one of the worst drug problems in Europe. 1% of the population was addicted to heroin, and every year they tried the American way more. They punished people, stigmatized them, and shamed them more. And every year the problem got worse. Let us set up a panel of scientists and doctors to figure out what would genuinely solve the problem. And they set up a panel led by an amazing man called Dr. Hua Gulao to look at all this new evidence. And they came back, and they said we can minimize all drugs from cannabis to crack, but, and this is the crucial next step, take all the money we used to spend on cutting addicts off, on disconnecting them, and spend it instead on reconnecting them with society. They set up a small association for addicts and microloans, for addicts to set up small businesses. So say someone used to be a mechanic and once they were clean, till they would go and work in a garage. If the owner employed this person for a year, the government agreed to pay half of his wages. The goal was to make sure that every addict in Portugal felt they had something to get out of bed for in the morning. These recovered addicts in Portugal said they had rediscovered purpose. They rediscovered bonds and relationships with the wider society. It has been 35 years ago since that experiment began, and, according to the British Journal of Criminology, by 50%, overdose is massively down. Addiction in every study is significantly down. One of the ways you know it has worked so well is that almost nobody in Portugal wants to go back to the old system. You know, we live in a culture where people are increasingly vulnerable to all sorts of addictions, to smartphones or to shopping, or to eating, and disconnection is a major driver of addiction. It might be weird to say it is growing because you think, well, we are the most connected society there has ever been, surely. But I increasingly began to think that the connection we have are like a kind of parody of human connection. If you have a crisis in your life, you will soon realize that it will not be your ex-followers who come to sit with you. It will not be your Facebook friends who help you turn it around. It will be your flesh and blood friends with whom you have deep and textured face-to-face relationships. The question is how many close friends you could call in a crisis. In our society today, people have traded stuff for connections. And the result is that we are one of the loneliest societies that has ever been. And yet, Bruce Alexander, the guy who did the Rat Park experiment, says, we talk all the time in addiction about individual recovery. And it is right to talk about that. But we need to talk much more about social recovery. And we have created a society where, for a lot of us, life looks a whole lot more like that isolated cage, and a whole lot less like Rat Park. So look at the addicts in your life, and in all honesty, it is hard to love an addict. But everyone has a bit of them that looks at an addict. And sometimes you wish someone would just stop you. But the problem really is how we go about that. Maybe you know addicts in your life that maybe you want to deepen the connection with them, to say to them, I love you whether you're using or you're not. I love you whatever state you're in. And if you need me, I'll come and sit with you, because I love you. And I don't want you to be alone or to feel alone. And I think the core of that message, you are not alone. We love you, must be at every level of how we respond to addicts, socially, politically, and individually. For 100 years now, we have been singing war songs about addicts. I think all along we should have been singing love songs to them, because the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The actual opposite of addiction